This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Sam Bidwell, writer and director of the Next Generation Centre at the Adam Smith Institute, on last week's extraordinary immigration numbers and what can be done about it.
The truth is we don't know the exact figures. By some estimates, the cost per head of a low-skilled migrant by the time that they reach 81 years of age is about £450,000 to the UK taxpayer, which is a greater cost for less input than the average UK worker.
I'm joined here in the studio by Fleur Meston, co-host of the Bombshells podcast, on the passage of the Assisted Dying Bill at its second reading and why that's a cause for concern.
The country is just not in a state to enact this equally. We've got dozens of MPs already calling for an expansion so that it would be unbearable suffering rather than terminal illness. It's just like, where do we stop?
And for our premium subscribers, I'm joined by Madeline Grant, parliamentary sketch writer at The Telegraph, who tells us about her ringside seat to the Mother of Parliaments and whether our present crop of MPs are up to scratch.
I did my own bit of quite amateur sleuthing, and I was just quite taken aback by how few of them had ever really had a job in the private sector. And those who had a job in the private sector, often it was like a PR type job. It was basically kind of a blob adjacent job in comms or PR.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month for the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Policies were reformed deliberately to liberalise immigration. Brexit was used to turn Britain into a one-nation experiment in open borders. Now, those are not the words of Reform leader Nigel Farage, nor are they the words of an outspoken right-wing polemicist or an anonymous online firebrand. They're the words of the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, in response to the latest immigration figures announced last week. What they make clear is that everyone, even the lefty lawyer in charge of the Labour Party, can see that immigration has been far, far too high, and that it's causing immense economic and social damage to our country. So how did this happen, and what can be done about it? Well, to discuss this very important issue, I'm pleased to be joined by Sam Bidwell, who's a writer and commentator at publications including The Critic, and who's the director of the Next Generation Centre at the Adam Smith Institute. Welcome to The Sceptic, Sam.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so let's get straight into the numbers, shall we? Tell us what the headline figures are from that bombshell immigration announcement last week.
So the ONS releases data on a quarterly basis. So we get data about the last 3 months and also about revisions of previous data sets. So this time we got data for 2024 for the first 3 quarters. And then we've also got some revised updates on 2023. The top line is basically that net migration for 2024 stands at more than 700,000 versus 900,000 for the previous year. But I think it's worth noting that over the last 3 years, 2024, 2023, and 2022, migration total, so not net, not subtracting the number of people who've come in, has totaled more than 1.2 million. So that's 3 years in a row, 1.2 million people, which takes you to 3.6 million in 3 years, which is pretty much the biggest migration to this country since the time of the Anglo-Saxons. So we're talking pretty big figures here. The other underlying shift that's happened really since Brexit, because of the points-based system that was introduced at that time, is that migration has become far more non-EU than EU. So when we voted to leave, the biggest chunk of our migration was coming from countries like Poland and Romania. The biggest incoming shifts this time were from countries like India. More than 1 million Indians have come to the UK since 2021. From countries like Nigeria, China. You'd be hard-pressed to argue that in 2016 these were the countries that people wanted more migration from. And yet, over the past 5 years, and particularly over the past 3 years, we've had millions in some cases and hundreds of thousands in other cases of Nigerians, Ghanaians, people from the rest of Africa, Indians, Pakistanis, etc. So that's really the big change, is not only the scale, but the type of migration.
And so to get into why this happened, I mean, a lot of people will be surprised in a way that this happened under Boris Johnson after Brexit. So what were the particular changes to our immigration system that allowed this to happen?
Sure. So it's a combination of a number of smaller factors. So the way that immigration rules work in the UK is that the Home Secretary amends what are called the immigration rules, have the power to do that under the 1971 Immigration Act. And at a number of junctures, the rules were changed. First with what they called the points-based system, which took us away from a system of discrimination on the basis of nationality towards one that in theory prioritized quality over quantity. What in fact has happened is that was calibrated poorly. We've ended up with the bar for points being far too low, meaning we get far too many people. And then there were some more specific things that have driven up figures. So people rightly point out that over the last 5 years, we've seen the war in Ukraine. We've seen an outpouring of Hong Kongers after China's intervention in that city. And we've seen, after the war in Afghanistan, a number of Afghans awarded visas. But it isn't just those causes which a lot of British people would be on board with. Our health and social care visa system, so we instituted a system for health and social care professionals with no cap on it. So we decided that there was a shortage. We didn't identify how many people we were short. And so we just had an unlimited route through which people could come to the country, often with quite sketchy qualifications. Then there are the reforms to graduates. We've made it much easier for people who study here in the UK to stay on as graduates, to remain in the country for a period of 2 years to seek work. And we've also made it easier for international students to come. We've lowered the requirements. Lots of the universities that we have in this country have lowered their requirements and have made it easier to switch from, say, a 1-year postgraduate degree to a work visa. So what you've created is a back channel through the student route. You've also created a number of smaller bespoke routes that have allowed the numbers to be driven up. And then you've seen an explosion in family and asylum cases. So our asylum system, as I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit more detail later on, has become much more relaxed about letting people in. It's much harder to remove people than it was many years ago. It's certainly much harder to turn down their applications for asylum. Meanwhile, lots of people are able to join family members who are in the UK because our rules around family reunification have also become liberalised. So it's a perfect storm of all the things that will drive up migration, which results in the high figures that we've got today.
And so to talk about two particular changes, there was the relaxation of the threshold for what counted as a skilled visa, right? And there was also the scrapping of the requirement for firms to advertise jobs in Britain first before they advertise them abroad. Now, I mean, Sam, how consequential were those changes?
So they were consequential. The skilled visa revision was part of the points-based system. So that came as part of that whole change. We changed around, basically we went from a system where you just had work visas to having tier 1 visas and tier 2 visas. Tier 2 is what's called skilled. So, right, so skilled is a misnomer, right? We're actually talking about the people at the lowest end of the economy. The reason we call it skilled is that you can apply for a skilled visa on the basis of a list of professions produced by the Home Office, which determines there to be a shortage of. Now, it determines the shortage based on what industry figures will tell the Home Office. So look through the list. I don't know if this is still true, but when I looked last, juggler was on there, wine bar manager was on there, right? All areas that we should obviously be opening up the borders to fill those vital positions, lest our economy collapse. What's even more remarkable is that the majority of people coming on so-called skilled visas are actually unlikely to be fiscal net contributors. Carl Williams at the CPS has done some really interesting work on this and has calculated that probably only about 5% of skilled visa holders are actually likely to become net fiscal contributors. So when we say skilled, we're not really talking about skilled. We're talking about a list of professions identified by the Home Office where there are apparently shortages. But this is quite an extensive list. And remember, lots of these people are coming from countries where you can't trust the qualifications. So we know that there are erroneous qualifications given out in countries like Nigeria. We have proven cases of this in the NHS. So now imagine if it's something as nebulous as wine bar owner, and you imagine how easy it would be to get a false certificate accrediting you as a sommelier from somebody in Lagos. That would actually qualify you to come to the UK, particularly because our English proficiency standards are actually quite low.
Okay, so there's lots of people coming in, and for various reasons, as you've been talking about, they're not as skilled as we might like. And so obviously the claim that's often made about immigration is that it will put rocket boosters under the economy, supposedly. But obviously it's actually quite basic economics that if you're having lots of unskilled labor coming in, then that can be to some extent a substitute for capital, and that can change the nature of our industry. And so just to take one example, we didn't used to have very many hand car washes 20 years ago or so, but now we do. And what's the effect been of this influx on the labour market?
Sure. So, I mean, you say rocket boosters under the economy. The UK economy has grown at sub 1% for a number of quarters in a row now, right? So if that's rocket boosters, then, we should start worrying about the fundamentals behind the economy. In per capita terms, there's really been no increase at all. We've added lots of people, and of course, therefore, size of the economy has shifted, but it hasn't actually increased per person. So we haven't made life better on a per person basis. And give you a couple of examples on the labour market question. Farming is one, agriculture. The UK has one of the least mechanised agricultural sectors in the Western world. The result is that it's deeply unproductive. So pound for pound, you've got a country like the Netherlands, tiny country, sixth biggest agricultural exporter in the world. That's because it relies on machinery and technology rather than on labour. We know from as far back as the Industrial Revolution that the best way to get people to invest in productivity enhancing technologies and to spend their capital that way is to make sure that labour is expensive, right? Expensive labour is a short-term hurdle that businesses are actually very good at overcoming. What we've done instead is we've reduced the labour side. We've made it very, very easy to get cheap labour, unskilled labour in fields like agriculture, in food service, in car washing is a really good example, as you highlighted. The result is that we've actually gone backwards in many ways when it comes to mechanisation. We've disincentivized businesses from spending money on those upfront costs. If you think about it, you're a farmer, it costs a lot of capital, right? It's a lot of upfront capital to invest in a machine. You don't know if it'll work, whereas you can pay somebody to pick strawberries very cheaply. And for a capital poor, asset rich field like farming or agriculture, that's a really enticing prospect, right? They've not got much money now. They might in the future, and they've got things that they can lend against, but they haven't got much cash on hand now. So of course they go for labour. What we could have had, right, is something more akin to Japan, and I'm not keen to replicate the Japanese economy. It's also very sluggish in terms of the way it grows. But they grow at about the same rate that we do. It's a larger economy than ours, but they grow at roughly the same rate, i.e. not very much. We both suffer from enormous bureaucracy, and yet we achieve roughly what they do with millions more people coming in, putting pressure on public services, damaging social cohesion. They've achieved roughly what we've achieved, but have done so through robotics and automation and allowing companies to make efficiencies where they can. So, if we're having to choose between two low growth models, I'd much rather have the Japanese system than ours.
Yeah, and let's just illustrate a little bit more the fiscal impact here. I mean, you mentioned by that one estimate, only 5% of these incomers are actually contributing to the tax system overall. And, there's various ways that they might actually be receiving fiscal transfers, whether that's through benefits and housing benefit and things like this. And there's also potentially bringing in dependents as well. And just give us a sense of the overall impact this is having fiscally.
Sure. So the truth is we don't know the exact figures. We can estimate, but because of the ONS's patchy data collection, we can't know the exact figures. By some estimates, the number, the cost per head of a low-skilled migrant by the time that they reach 81 years of age is about £450,000 to the UK taxpayer. That's the median figure. So about half costing us more, about half costing us less, which is a greater cost for less input than the average UK worker. Now, in its own calculations, the ONS alleges that this is a small number of migrants, and actually, as we've laid out, probably it's the majority. So we're talking per head just shy of 500,000 over a lifetime, writ large, given once again 3.6 million over the past 3 years. You say roughly 95% of those people will actually not be net contributors. You're looking at a scarily large bill in terms of social care, in terms of healthcare, in terms of social housing, etc. The rules on that depend on the visa that you've come in on, but under most rules, provided that it's not a study visa doesn't count as long-term settlement, but a work or family or asylum visa, you normally have to spend 5 years in the UK to get what's called indefinite leave to remain. That means you can stay, claim benefits, bring family members. Sometimes you can bring family members even while you're working, but that depends on the route. Those dependents are not obliged to be working, right? So not only are we paying for the individual person who comes here and works, let's say that person breaks even on their tax contribution over a lifetime. Not impossible. If they then bring a wife who doesn't work, you remember many of our top destinations for migrants are cultures where it's unusual for women to work. So it's not like we're bringing in people from Sweden and Spain, where it's pretty normal for both a husband and a wife to have a job. You're bringing in potentially a wife who doesn't work. You're bringing in potentially children who then have to be educated. You're bringing in sometimes elderly dependents, so parents, provided that a parent pays some national insurance for 10 years. So let's say you bring somebody in at 60 and they do a bit of shift work and they pay some tax over a period of 10 years. The NI threshold is only something like 12,000. So any real employment would get them over the line. That person is then eligible to receive a state pension, triple lot state pension, which increases year on year. That's off 10 years of paltry contributions. And you're here on a work visa, you can bring over parents, you can bring over kids, you can bring over a spouse. So what we're talking about here is on an individual basis, a net fiscal negative, but also there are implications more broadly about the kind of people that work visa holding migrants can bring in once they hit that ILR status after just 5 years.
Yeah, very worrying. And so we'll speak about indefinite leave to remain in a moment. But let's just talk about this latest wave. Now, some people call this the Boris wave, right? And it's actually quite noticeable. I think that's one of the things about it. I mean, I notice it often when I'm nearly hit by someone who's cycling on the pavement because they're delivering Deliveroo and they apparently don't know that you're not supposed to cycle on the pavement. This wave has actually been quite visible to people, especially if they're living in cities, over the past few years. And I suppose, what are some of the ways that people might have noticed this, affecting them in their daily lives?
Well, look, Britain has basically, in broad terms, drawn immigrants from two places historically, in the kind of short term of the last 100 years. Previously, it was Commonwealth migrants. There was a post-war phase of Commonwealth migration from India, from Pakistan, from West Africa, and from the West Indies. One can make arguments about the degree to which those communities have integrated. We see real difficulties around, for example, the Pakistani community in places like Birmingham and Bradford. But at least those were identifiable communities that one could point to and say that there is a historical relationship between this country and Britain, this community and Britain, and whether or not we think that they're well integrated, we can at least identify them. There was then a second wave post really 2004, the expansion of the European Union into Eastern Europe, of European, particularly Eastern European migration, once again, not suggesting that community integrated perfectly. Certainly in places like Boston, Lincolnshire, you'd have plenty of people willing to say that Polish migration was a great shame, a great disaster. But again, it was an identifiable group. What characterizes the most recent wave is a complete lack of cohesion. Right? It's too many people too quickly from too many places. There's nothing that unites this group. There is nothing that ties them to Britain. There is no attempt made at integration, because how could one integrate 3.6 million people over a period of 3 years? It's not possible. Even the most effective state in the world couldn't do that. We are getting beyond the levels of migration per annum that America was seeing in the Ellis Island period. In fact, we're beyond that. So when we think about this kind of great story in the 1920s, millions moving across to America, per capita, we're actually seeing a bigger wave here today. So it's a lack of cohesion. I think in everyday service interactions, poor quality of English is now a complete characteristic. When I'm in London, most of my service interactions have some level of friction associated with them. That's not to denigrate any individual, but it is to say that we've done a terrible job of making sure that people who come here actually speak English. The requirements that we've set are far too low, and this introduces a level of misunderstanding to everyday interactions. Deliveroo is one example that you cite. It is completely identifiable when you have motorbikes going on the pavement that a lot of these people are coming from cultures with very different social and behavioural norms, and it really does start to have an effect. There is the perennially cited playing music out loud on the bus. This is another kind of visible sign of people from very different cultures with different approaches to things like public space. That's not just an individual thing. That's to do with public space norms. I'm here in the Middle East as I dive into you now, and the approach to public space here is different to what it is in Britain. There is a different sense of one's duties and obligations and privileges one can take in public space. Britain has a fairly quiet, reserved, respectful public space culture, which is not shared by everybody else in the world. And so when you have this large group of people from all sorts of places, not unified by anything, of course you're going to end up with differing social norms playing out on the streets.
And I think it's worth dwelling for a second on this phrase global Britain that was used by Boris Johnson and others to sort of tout Brexit. And in fact, in Keir Starmer's recent speech, we'll get onto that in a minute, but he was actually using that to make fun of Boris Johnson, essentially, and that phrase in general. Because, if you're a 2016 Brexit voter or a 2019 Boris Johnson voter, you're probably thinking, I want to express my social conservatism here, express my long-standing opposition to immigration that's already been too high, and to say, well, if we are going to have it, we want to have it from closely aligned cultures, and we want it to be high skill. And instead, what they got was immigration from, further afield cultures, which was low skill. And I mean, Sam, just give us an idea of how much of a betrayal that is in terms of democratic politics.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we don't have to guess, right? We don't. There is this great myth that we have to guess at what Brexit voters were thinking and what Boris voters were thinking. We don't. There's a great poll conducted by YouGov in 2016. You can go away and find it. I encourage listeners to do so. It details country by country which places Brits want more immigration from and which places they want less from, right? And both Leave and Remain was very clear. People wanted more migration from the US, from Canada, from Australia, from Western Europe, France, Germany, Netherlands, etc. They explicitly wanted less immigration from India, Nigeria, Pakistan, Turkey, etc. All the countries that we've ended up with more immigration from. In particular, I'm struck by the fact 1 million Indians over the last 4 years since 2021, 5% of Brits in 2016 in that poll said that they wanted more Indian immigration to the UK. This is not just undemocratic, it's completely undemocratic. There is no mandate for this whatsoever. There was this great myth that we would use the tools, having left the European Union, to take back control. What we've actually done is given up control because our politicians are not used to, and haven't been used to for a number of decades, actually making rules. They've been able to shunt responsibility to Brussels. It's like when you go back and spend time with your parents and you realize that all your social skills and your ability to keep a house is atrophying, right? You've let it all go. Your mum cooks for you, your dad picks up the washing, etc. It all goes. British politicians are a bit like that. They spend too much time in Europe. They've forgotten how to make rules that actually function. They've forgotten what the state can and actually can't do. And so we've ended up with a system with complete lack of control, despite the promise repeatedly of taking back control, giving people control of the borders, giving people control of who's coming and from where. Crucially, that's what it was about. It was about control. And that's completely what we've lost.
Right. And so in terms of potentially taking back control, to use that phrase, obviously Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, has delivered a quite extraordinary, rhetorically at least, speech last week about this. And in fact, I did mention it at the start, but we'll just play a clip of this now.
This is a different order of failure. This happened by design, not accident. Policies were reformed deliberately to liberalise immigration. Brexit was used for that purpose, to turn Britain into a one-nation experiment in open borders.
So really quite strong words there, especially from the centre-left Labour Prime Minister, right? And how significant is that, Sam? Does this, inaugurate a total paradigm shift on immigration?
Look, it's really enticing rhetoric, but I think anybody who's spent time around or thinking about British politics over the last 5 or 10 years is really bored of rhetoric. Yes, what it does do is it legitimises some of the narratives that people on the right have been coming out with about the degree to which we've surrendered control of the borders. I think that's useful. I think it gives the public space, it gives migration skeptics the ability to use this kind of language in the public space. This is now uncontroversial language that's being used by the Prime Minister. I'm not confident as to whether or not it marks policy paradigm shifts. I think it's easy to say these things. I think it's much harder to do anything, particularly because, and this is true of all difficult political decisions or worthwhile political decisions, they all require upsetting somebody. And I think what we've seen from this government so far is that it views politics through the lens of stakeholders to be managed, groups who hold some stake in society, who are somewhat influential, and who exist to be managed and placated. And I think there are certain industries, I'm thinking particularly about the universities, that you would upset if you took substantive action on migration. If you reduced the number of people coming in, you would definitely cause a funding stream for some of our universities to dry up. You would have pushback from, to some extent, the hospitality sector, which has relied on low skilled migration rather than investing in productivity-saving technologies. That kind of pushback is hard for any government to withstand, let alone a government which has already shown, that is deeply unpopular with the public. We've seen how quickly Keir Starmer's approval rating has fallen. We've seen what the polls say about Labour winning kind of 25%. And that is not to say that the Conservatives are going to sweep in next time. What we've actually seen is that Reform picked up a lot of that support. But Labour are way down in the polls. It's an unpopular Prime Minister. It's a Prime Minister who hasn't shown any great leadership or vision. I think the rhetoric is useful. I think it's nice now to have an open and honest recognition of the fact that policy has gone wrong. I think to get substantive change through, there has to be an even deeper paradigm shift wherein politicians actually start to be comfortable upsetting some of these stakeholders.
Yes, and they need to follow through, right? And so in terms of things one might be hoping for them to do, I know you've been writing about that today. And so, if one admits that this entire Boris wave was essentially a mistake, then one of the things that one could do would be to not give all of this recent wave indefinite leave to remain, which is typically the status that comes up 5 years after having arrived in the country. And so, tell us a bit about that and some other measures that one might be thinking of implementing.
Sure. So look, the Prime Minister has said that the last 3 years of migration was a mistake. Now, if I make a mistake and I'm in a position to reverse it, I do. I don't just go, oh, that's a shame, oh, well, let's move on. Right? I address the mistake that I've made, I try and do things differently, and if I can reverse the worst impacts, I do. Fortunately, we can reverse the worst impacts. Right? We're choosing not to. The ILR that I mentioned before, indefinite leave to remain, becomes accessible after 5 years of residence in the UK for most permit holders. For some, it's 10. For some, it can be even shorter. For those for whom it is shorter, 2 to 3 years, we're talking really about high-skilled people and investors. So really, that's not a group that we necessarily want to touch. And also, they're quite a small group. We're talking about a few thousand each year. And so for the vast majority of migrants who come on work visas, there is an ability to access ILR status after 5 years of living here. That could be changed overnight by the Home Secretary if the political will was there. Under the 1971 Immigration Act, it's up to the Home Secretary to set the immigration rules. They can amend those rules through a statutory instrument. So long as Parliament doesn't pass a resolution condemning the instrument within 40 days, that stands, that's then the law. There is generally a customary vote on those rule changes. But if the Labour government whipped sufficiently, I suspect that you could get support for a change to the immigration rules. And what you could do is you could say, well, okay, we're going to take the period from 5 years to 15 years, which is what I propose in the article that I wrote this morning. You can say, well, we're going to use this extra 10 years to review whether or not we want to reissue these visas. Remember, somebody gets a 5-year visa, they're not entitled to have that visa renewed forever. Right? There's nowhere in the rules that says this. If the government decides that it doesn't want you to remain in the UK, we are well within our rights to say we don't want you to remain within the UK. The citizens of a country are the first duty of a government, of any such country. It is incumbent upon this government to put the wishes and interests of citizens first, by saying, look, we are going to extend the period of ILR. We're going to give ourselves more time to review whether or not we think these visa grants were given out in error. And if it decides that those are in error, it shouldn't reissue them. It should encourage people to move back to wherever it is that they came from in the first place. There are other things you could do too. So a future government could institute a change to the 2002 Nationality and Borders Act, I believe it's called, which would allow revocation of ILR. In other words, you could take it back once it's been given. Countries like Sweden are already doing this. There's no reason that somebody comes, say, commits a crime or refuses to integrate. There's no reason that we could remove that person's indefinite to remain. That's a political choice. You could tighten up rules around when people can bring dependents. You could raise the salary that somebody has to be earning to be allowed to bring family members, to make sure that, for example, we don't hurt American bankers working in the city who want to bring their wives over, but we do prevent chain migration from countries like India, Pakistan. And there are a number of other changes that you can make, all of these under the auspices of the Home Secretary's powers to change the immigration rules. Not doing so is a choice. I set out in the piece that I wrote this morning for the Adam Smith Institute exactly how you could do it. There is a legislative template there. There is detail on how it would look, process it would take, etc. Not doing it is now a political choice.
And so to go just a bit further on that, So we've been through how actually the supposed economic justification for this, that they'd all contribute to the economy a lot, it is not really borne out by the data. But even if it were, it surely doesn't really have to follow that just because you needed some temporary workers in social care or whatever, that you actually have to therefore stick with the broad scale demographic change and the social changes that would bring by letting all of these people come in and then be permanent residents of the country, right? I mean, so there seems to be this logical relation between letting people be temporary workers and then letting them settle. But I mean, does there have to be so?
Absolutely not. I mean, I forget who says it, but the old saying goes, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary measure. And you may say in the British context, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary migrant. That needn't be the case. So go to a country like the UAE, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, you go to a country like Singapore. Both of those countries rely heavily on foreign labour. Singapore is a dynamic economy in which Singaporeans earn great wages, but a lot of the low-skilled work is done by people from other parts of Southeast Asia. The government doesn't feel any obligation to tie work to citizenship, right? It accepts that you can work somewhere for 5 years, you can earn a bit of money. Somebody from the Philippines is earning more working tables in Singapore than they would be back in Manila. But the Singaporean government doesn't feel the need to change its demographic balance or to change its social balance or to upset the social fabric by allowing that person to become a citizen. Because frankly, the biggest long-term impact of migration are those generational impacts. So we're seeing in parts of the country now like Birmingham, or in places like Burnley, or in Rochdale, where there's been a generational move away from some of the cultural norms that existed in this country uncontroversially 50 or 70 years ago. And the result, the reason for that is that temporary Pakistani migrants who came to northern mill towns and to the industrial centres of the Midlands to plug temporary labour gaps were given citizenship. They had children, they built communities. Scale and the level of intense concentration meant that those people didn't have to integrate, and they haven't. Right? And what we've seen in the last election is sectarian independent candidates and Labour candidates supported by sectarian campaigners getting elected on, frankly, deeply illiberal, deeply uncomfortable, deeply anti-national platforms, promising things to the Muslim community and the Muslim community alone. That is the generational impact of mismanaged mass migration. At that time, we were talking about a few tens of thousands of people per annum. Talking about 50,000, 70,000 people per annum. We're now talking about millions per annum. That gives you an idea of what the long-term consequences of allowing the temporary workers who've come over in the last few years to remain as citizens. This gives you an idea of the negative impact that this could have. And so we can act now, we should act now, because ILR puts you on the path to citizenship, which puts you on the path to settlement, which puts you on the path to having children, voting, building your own communities, etc. And we've seen how this has frayed the social fabric of the country, not just in terms of elections, but in terms of social cohesion, in terms of crime, in terms of many, many other things. The best thing to do and the smartest thing to do in the long term is to say, okay, we need 50,000 people to come in and be nurses for 5 years. When that 5 years is up, you go home, regardless of how good you've been, regardless of what money you've earned, regardless of whatever else you've done. And you make the institutions which hire people, so whether it's businesses or the state, culpable for that person's removal. You say, look, if you, as a business, hire 300 guest workers, construction company hires 300 guest workers. If any of those workers commit a crime, you're getting fined as a business. If any of those workers tries to remain when they shouldn't, you're getting a fine. I guarantee the system works a lot better if you say, okay, we're going to disaggregate settlement and work. We're going to come here and work, temporary period, under certain conditions. And we're going to make the company that you work for, or the employer you work for, culpable for bad things that you do, crime, refusal to leave, etc. I guarantee that's a better system, and it's working very, very well in other parts of the world.
Okay, and so finally, in terms of the politics of this, we've mentioned how Starmer has, to some extent, taken the wind out of the sails of the right by almost resetting the whole paradigm here. But so, I mean, how should the right be reacting to this? And is there a possibility of actually getting into a virtuous circle here where the right is essentially holding Starmer's feet to the fire on his own rhetoric. I mean, could that be a possibility?
Absolutely. The best thing that the right will do is to propose detailed, constructive and effective policy measures that the government can then choose to implement or not implement. Right? The reason that governments have been able to get away with not doing what promised to do on migration is that they've been able to hide behind the idea that this is a hard issue that's difficult to face. The best thing the right can be doing, okay, if you're serious about this, Keir, and you actually want to bring migration down, and you actually want to stop the long-term harms of the last couple of years, here's a bit of legislation, right? We'll table it for you. We'll put it on the table for you. Vote it through. If you're really serious about it, vote it through. And if Starmer whips against it, all he's done is proven that he's not serious about it. And you force a reckoning with that fact. You force the public to see this is somebody who says things that he's not serious about delivering. What you also do is you make sure that if and when the right gets back into power, in whatever shape or form, there is oven-ready legislation that you can just plug in and run with. Right? There's no process of dithering. There's no process of finding out what needs to happen. We've got the recipe, as it were. It's just a case of cooking it up. Pass that through early on in the Parliament and actually get some changes through. But in the short term, whilst Labour are in government, the best thing that the right can be doing is proposing proactive solutions that Labour then has to deal with. Right? It either has to accept them, in which case we get a better policy outcome, we get lower immigration and less impactful immigration, or it chooses to turn it down for ideological reasons, and it shows that it's all talk, it's all rhetoric. Let's not let them have this game on their own terms. Let's make sure that they do it on our terms, propose proactive things that they have to accept or reject.
Okay, well, Sam Bidwell, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Great, thanks for having me.
Now, the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill has passed its second reading in the House of Commons by 330 votes for to 275 against. Many campaigners are delighted that what they see as assisted dying has got one step closer to law in the United Kingdom. But others, however, are concerned, not just at this prospect, but also whether this weighty issue has received sufficient scrutiny from our lawmakers. Last week's vote went through after just 5 hours of debate. For context, Parliament's 2004 ban on fox hunting took some 400 hours in the chamber. So to discuss this, I'm very pleased to be joined by Fleur Meston, commentator, co-host of the Bombshells podcast, and a campaigner against what she calls assisted suicide. So welcome to The Sceptic, Fleur.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so let's start off by one of the ways that you sort of entered quite dramatically into this debate in a way, which was last week in the run-up to the actual vote in the Commons, was you were heading to work in Westminster, and you saw what you described quite evocatively as the Westminster death tunnel. Now, and this was adverts for assisted dying in the tube in Westminster. Now, just tell us about what was going on there and your reaction to it.
Yeah, so I've seen a couple of the smaller posters, by the escalators in the West End, and it's quite jarring seeing them against adverts for musicals. But this was, it was coming through the tunnel that goes like under Whitehall, and 10 huge billboards lining the tunnel with people saying, "My dying wish is to basically have an assisted death or an assisted suicide." And I thought, gosh, this is quite something, especially when you consider that there's been many adverts banned on the tube for things like promoting unrealistic body standards, or there was a dating app that was banned for being ageist, all adverts for foods high in fat, salt and sugar, which now includes porridge. So these things are all banned, which I don't agree with at all, but the fact that they are, and yet something that is promoting death is okay, was quite startling. What also is interesting is this tunnel is completely not accessible to people in wheelchairs. So it's sort of, there's already no sort of balance in the transport system for vulnerable people and disabled people that this bill would affect. And yet that's the perfect place that they think to advertise. Another issue is it's very insensitive, considering there have been as many as 72 suicide attempts a year on the London Underground, to be promoting that to people who could be walking through there with that in the back of their mind is, I think, completely tasteless and so wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point you make. Promoting it, right? And of course, there's so many different things that are banned on the tube. And yet this is, I think that's a good point to make, that it's really fundamentally changing the relationship between the state and the citizen in a way, because if you might think some people would have to do this, in extremis perhaps, but actually it's saying this is something that could be positive. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we think we have a state that wants to protect us and look after us. Perhaps I feel some more than others. But this would be such a fundamental change, especially the relationship between a doctor and a patient, where a patient would usually just go for them for treatment or to help alleviate symptoms if it's a terminal illness. And yet now doctors, if this bill passes, doctors will be able to offer them death instead, which is also completely goes against the Hippocratic Oath to preserve life. But the country is just not in a state, I think, even for people that agree with the principle of assisted suicide, to enact this equally. I know I'm sounding a bit left-wing here, but I recently read the Marie Curie report on the state of palliative care in this country, and the fact that it's essentially a postcode lottery if you get good palliative care. And that means that people in rural areas or poorer areas just don't have that access to this. So they would probably think, well, nothing's able to alleviate my suffering, and so I'll just die.
I mean, I think that's a good point that, so you will call this assisted suicide, of course. Others will call it assisted dying. And let's get into that there, I think, because that's an important, really, it seems to many people like a euphemism, actually, assisted dying. I mean, why do you make the point of saying assisted suicide?
I do, because it's what it is. If the system would be a doctor providing a patient with pills or a liquid to take their own life, I think taking your own life is suicide, right? But the other side do not want to use this because suicide sounds tragic. So they'll go with assisted dying, which also covers euthanasia. So there's a difference between assisted suicide, doctor gives you the things to take yourself, and euthanasia, doctor kills you. Assisted dying covers both. So it's both a way for them to avoid the negative connotations, but potentially to cover up the fact they might be in favour of euthanasia as well. But when Kat Eccles stood up in the debate on Friday and said that it's offensive language, and that the Samaritans had even said that you shouldn't use the word assisted suicide, that was a complete lie. They've never said that. And I did not like that at all, because policing language in the chamber, I think, is very wrong, especially when there is a very good reason for using the accurate terminology.
Yeah, I mean, and the Samaritans would know, right? And that's something they would be very, very against. Okay. And so, there's a lot to discuss about the bill itself, but as we've discussed, it's a change of principle here. And obviously there's been claims that there'll be safeguards and that the scope of the law won't be widened. But, how true is that? I mean, we've had actually quite a lot of examples of what's happened in countries like Canada, the Netherlands. I mean, give us an idea of what we could be heading for.
Okay, I'll start with what's happened elsewhere. So in Canada, the law was introduced in 2016 just for terminal illness. And because of challenges from the courts, that was expanded within 5 years to unbearable suffering, which is completely subjective. How is anyone supposed to measure whether someone's suffering unbearably? So that was just in 5 years. And in 2027, we are now due to have people able to have made medical assistance in dying for mental health problems. So that's basically just suicide, but done by the state.
And made, of course, another euphemism there.
Yeah. Then we've got Oregon, which is often used as the example of where things have gone brilliantly, including by Kim Leadbeater. They say that there's been no expansion in the eligibility criteria, and that the law has never changed since 1997, which technically is true, although regarding eligibility, they have changed what counts as a terminal illness, so it's if you denied treatment, you die, which has resulted in deaths for people with anorexia, arthritis, diabetes, hernias, complications from a fall, which, like, I'm sure we all know people that have these issues and live fantastic lives and shouldn't be having an assisted death. But 48% of people who've had an assisted death in Oregon say that the reason was not pain or suffering, it was because they felt like a burden. They've also expanded, cut the requirement to live in Oregon, which has resulted in sort of euthanasia tourism, people coming from other states. And in 97, there was, I think, 60% of people going for an assisted death would have a psychiatric assessment. That's now down to 1%. So whilst they haven't changed the law, I don't think this is an example that we should be following. However, we've got dozens of MPs already calling for an expansion so that it would be unbearable suffering rather than terminal illness. I think 2 in the chamber, one of them being Sean Berry from the Green Party, said that 6 months was just an arbitrary limit and that we should have it for longer. It's just like, where do we stop? A massive minority of the public actually want it further than what's being proposed in this bill. But yeah, it's very alarming because, especially with the ECHR, things can be challenged. And if you have one rule for certain people in the country and not the rest, people are obviously going to challenge that, and we could end up going the same way as Canada.
Okay, so let's talk, that's sort of more on the principle there, but let's talk about this bill in particular. And one of the things that people have been annoyed about really is that supposedly this was supposed to be, this is one crucial debate and we'd really go over this issue well. But in fact, we've only had about 2 or 3 weeks to actually look at the legislation before the debate happened. And as I mentioned in my introduction, only 5 hours in the chamber for it to be debated. So, what are some of the specifics about the bill that perhaps have been overlooked by some of its proponents?
With the limited time we've had to look at it, which was very bad. I think it was just over 2 weeks since the bill was released before the vote. And you're completely right. What was it? 400 hours for fox hunting, which is the lives of foxes, compared to 5 hours for the lives of humans. Seems insane. Okay, I've got some notes for the problems with the bill. First of all, it doesn't require someone to be suffering, only to be terminally ill. So someone could actually physically be, manageable, but they could choose this because of mental health issues is what causes you to want to die, right? So there's that. The definition of terminal illness requires a prognosis for which timeframes are notoriously unreliable. I think it's only half of prognoses are accurate. So someone could be told they have 6 months left to live for years, and then because they've got this diagnosis, they've cut their life short, missed out on valuable time with friends and family and enjoying life. Doctors would be allowed to proactively discuss the possibility of assisted suicide with a patient unprompted, which is super alarming when you've seen what's happened in Canada when someone becomes very expensive to treat, or they need a stair lift or adapted housing or things like that. A doctor could think, wow, this person's a real strain on the NHS. Let me just offer them this way out and a way of stopping having to pay for their treatment. It also allows for doctor shopping in this bill. So people might not get the answer that they want from one doctor. They just go somewhere else and try around until one of them says, sure, you can die. The bill does not require transparency. So families could find out that their relative has had an assisted death only after it's happened. Right. So, yeah, I think that's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, because a lot of the argument for this is about autonomy and freedom. And people don't seem to remember that your individual choices do affect a lot of the people around you. Like if one of my family members went for this and I only found out afterwards, I would be absolutely devastated. I think that's really scary. Then there's the pressure on the judiciary, which we already know we've got huge backlogs in the courts. Would this result in things being rushed through, not checked properly, sort of rubber stamping pre-filled in things, which often happens with people who are released from hospitals into care homes? They just get a pre-signed form saying do not resuscitate because of dementia. That's already happening. So how are we going to protect people that could be vulnerable to this when the courts just don't have the capacity? No right of appeal by family members if a court approves an application for an assisted death. And, who knows a person better than their family in most cases? If they think the court's got it wrong, they're not allowed to say that. It also would force doctors with conscience objections to be involved in the process through referral. So they can not take part in providing the assisted death, but they would have to refer it to someone that would, which I think puts them in a very difficult position. And, for example, Christian care homes and hospices, which a lot of them are, would not be allowed to. They would not be allowed to forbid staff from participation in either referring or doing an assisted death.
I mean, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there's been this claim about autonomy, right? And that people should be able to do whatever they like. But actually, this is, as that really suggests, that it's changing a whole social norm if people aren't allowed to conscientiously object to this, right?
Yeah. Many more. There is no requirement for a doctor to be present in the same room when the death occurs. So that just leaves the doors wide open for abuse. This is a big one. The bill would allow a doctor to assist with the actual administration of lethal drugs. So that blurs the line with euthanasia, which, as of now, supporters of the bill are saying this is not euthanasia. This is just for people that can take the drugs themselves, which obviously will be challenged because that's discriminatory against people who are physically unable to take the drugs themselves. The slippery slope. Okay.
So, and just to be very clear, so I mean, the general way this would be working would be someone would be given a pill and they would take it themselves. Is that the typical thing? Right
now, the bill says approved drugs. The ones which are used in Canada are the same drugs that are used for. In Oregon are the same drugs that are used for death sentence. So, which apparently it's not actually a painless death. There's one drug which paralyzes you so you don't show any signs of pain, and the other one basically causes you to drown. So it's very uncomfortable, but anyone witnessing it doesn't see that. So it's not this good death that is it's displayed to be.
Yes, in the adverts. And I mean, you can see why campaigners for it don't really want to use this word suicide, because that's, kind of gesturing to this kind of thing, which is actually very dark, whereas it's been presented in this euphemistic way. So let's get on a bit to the actual debate itself on Friday. Obviously, as we mentioned, it was shorter than it really should have been. But what did you make of the debate? Who performed well? What was good about it? What perhaps wasn't so good?
I'm an emotional person. I was crying at quite a few of the speeches. I thought Danny Kruger, he really knows his stuff on this. He actually did a documentary a few years ago because his mother, Prue Leith, is a patron of Humanists UK, and they are big advocates for this. So they did a road trip to Canada to explore the reality of it there, and had some difficult conversations because he is probably the lead MP campaigning against this. But he was very good, despite the intervention from Kat Eccles trying to shut him up. Robert Jenrick was amazing, very emotional, talking about the difficult conversations that people will have to have, and the conversations that people won't have and will make their minds up on their own. And then Diane Abbott and Florence Eshalomi had some more personal stories. My home MP, Mary Foy talked about how throughout her daughter's life, she'd constantly been given 6 months left to live and lived for 27 years and had a great life, and how vulnerable she would be to this. I did sort of, when the vote came out, I thought, how on earth have over 300 of you heard these stories and still come out with that conclusion, although I am biased.
Well, to pull you up on that for a second then, I mean, obviously you're on one side of this issue, but were there any interventions from the other side that you actually appreciated or that you thought were powerful?
I wouldn't say so, actually, because I just see so many flaws with their arguments, and there was some lies as well. I mean, Kim Leadbeater said that there's been no jurisdiction where it's expanded beyond terminal illness when they've started with it. Well, that's just false. Canada has. But it's not surprising, considering 2 months ago was the first time she'd ever made a public statement on this. I'm not surprised that she doesn't know the full extent of how it's gone wrong elsewhere. She also said that judges were supporting her, and then she had to make a point of order at the end and say, sorry, made that up. So I wasn't impressed with that side.
Yeah, fair enough. But I suppose one of the criticisms that has been made of proponents here is that actually they have been quite unwilling to admit that the claims that you and I have been talking about the slippery slope and things like this. But of course, there is another side to this issue, right? And I think one of the interventions was was certainly an emotive anecdote, if it wasn't actually a powerful argument, was Kit Malthouse, who talked about someone he knew at least who basically wanted to die and ended up going to a train track somewhere and killing himself with the last train, which a lot of people I think were probably affected by. But can you at least sort of set out the broad brushstrokes of why someone might, be in favour of this argument? I mean, there is the argument to reduce suffering, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's many reasons why people are in favour. And one interesting thing is the for and against is not party political at all. There's groups all across the spectrum who are for or against this bill. But yeah, so certain groups may be in favour because of autonomy and freedom, libertarian standpoints. Some conservatives said that that's what conservatives should stand for, and that's why they should support it. And then there's sort of the religious right who oppose it because of sanctity of life, and then there is the socialists who oppose it because it's unequal and people aren't getting the help they need and the NHS is in a bad state. I think the best reason is compassion for suffering, which I do share, and some of the stories that you hear are absolutely horrific, and you think, well, people always say you wouldn't let a dog die like that. We're not dogs, we're humans. But I think that there is much, much more that we can be doing to improve the end of people's lives before even considering debating this. The last time that this was voted on was 2015, and there's been negligible change since then in the standard of care at the end of lives and the state of the NHS and all of that stuff. So even if I agreed with it, I would want to see other things in place before revisiting this.
Fair enough. And so you spoke about the politics there a bit. Interesting that it sort of wasn't entirely splitting over party lines. But of course it was brought in, wasn't whipped supposedly and was brought in as a private member's bill. But then there's also the slightly odd fact that Keir Starmer has said he's in favour of it, and he said he's going to allocate some parliamentary time to debate this as a favour to Esther Rantzen, who's this celebrity TV presenter who probably some people I hadn't really heard of her before this, but it's slightly strange to some people that this was not in the Labour manifesto, but it seems that the one person to whom Keir Starmer can't break a promise is this celebrity. I mean, how have you felt about the way this debate was forwarded? Yeah,
very dodgy. Esther Rantzen, I didn't know that we'd elected her to bring have these promises made. Keir Starmer did effectively decriminalise assisting someone to go to Dignitas when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. So he decided that it wasn't in the public interest to investigate these people. So, which, there could be coercion there. You could be saying, I don't think my inheritance should be spent on care homes. Why don't we take a small amount of it and we'll go to Switzerland together and it'll be really nice. But yeah, he's been involved with this for a long time. And then we've got, so basically, the first person that was going to do this bill was Jake Richards. He came 11th in the private members' bill ballot. And he used to work for Lord Falconer, who has attempted to change the law on this 7 times and failed every time. But Jake, I'll give him that he has been interested in this subject for over a decade and clearly passionate about it. But he has worked with Dignity in Dying, who in 2015 wrote Meach's bill. So they have been involved with this every step of the way. They used to be called the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, and a lot of their founding members had links to eugenics, things like that. They've got a ton of money, which they spend on cheap adverts and things like this. But they clearly saw Kim Leadbeater came number 1. Jake Richards suddenly says, "Oh, I'm not going to do this bill anymore," and Kim Leadbeater does it. It's clearly designed to get the most parliamentary time. I don't know if Starmer was involved or who, but it's not been all above board. Yeah.
And yes, I think it's a good point you make about the fact that she hasn't really spoken about this in the past, and so she really makes a somewhat unlikely face of this bill. And of course, we heard in most of the contributions in the Commons this almost ritual phrase, which was, thank you to the member for Batley, or is it Spen Valley now, I think, for how well this debate has been conducted. Is that a fair assessment?
I think leaving just over 2 weeks for people to analyse it is not good. I also think that her saying that she was incredibly upset that Wes Streeting opposed it just sounds a bit like a toddler that can't get its own way. Everyone, it's a free vote, he's allowed to have an opinion, and she would one day be attacking Shabana Mahmood for opposing it on religious grounds, the next day meeting Rabbi Jonathan Romaine and Lord Carey, the former Archbishop, who are in favour of it, and saying, yes, even our religious leaders are on our side. So I'm just like, well, is religion good or bad in this case? She just didn't seem to have much consistency. It just felt like all she wanted was her own way, same as Esther Ranson, who I think she was complaining about Wes Streeting as well, who I think has been one of the most honest in this debate, considering he voted in favour in 2015 and has come to the point where he says, I am still in favour in principle, but as a country, we're not in a position to do this safely.
Right, yeah.
So,
and he would know, I suppose, being in charge of the NHS. Okay, and so finally, it's the second reading now. Most bills that go to second reading do pass, but this was 55 votes, I think. So some people that voted for it this at this reading said, well, actually, we can look again at parts of it, and I might not vote for it in the final stage. David Davis is one of those. What's next for this bill? Might it fall still?
It definitely can still fall. I think certain MPs who were very involved with the campaign for the bill were encouraging others to vote for it now and sort out the details later, which I don't like that, but it gives me some hope that they will change their mind. And at least 36 MPs made it clear that they only did so to allow further debate, and they've already got concerns and they haven't committed to supporting it at third reading. So with the margin of 55, if 28 MPs can change their mind from pro to against, then it's won.
Right.
And I can relax.
Yes, we'll see what happens. Okay, I think that's pretty much all we've got time for. So, Fleur Meston, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks for having me.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.